9. Maya Campbell. Former actress Maya Campbell rose to stardom during the early 90s. Her main claims to fame were her roles on TV series called South Central and In the House. Her fall from grace started in the 2000s, when she struggled with addiction and was seen acting erratically in public multiple times, some of which were caught on video. In 2015, Campbell was accused of 2 separate incidents. The first happened at a Burger King in Atlanta, where she cursed out a family and accused a child of stealing her wallet. She also harassed the responding police officer, according to an arrest report from that day. Campbell is perhaps best remembered for the shocking footage of her supposedly strung out on drugs that has surfaced over the years. One viral video from 2017 shows a disheveled woman that's allegedly Campbell stating she was looking for crack. According to a self-help guru named Ileana Van Zandt, who worked with the troubled actress in 2012, Campbell was addicted to crystal meth and allowed men to use her to feed her habit. She used the drugs to self-medicate symptoms of bipolar disorder and built up trauma from her past. Her latest arrest happened in 2020 when she was busted for street racing. A woman who regularly ran into Campbell at a local gas station said that she wasn't doing well at all and was often seen asking people for money and rides. Who knows what she's doing now? 8. Phil Spector. Although he made his fortune in the 1960s and most young people today have never heard of him, Phil Spector is considered one of the most successful music producers and songwriters of all time. The Grammy Award winner worked with artists including The Beatles, The Righteous Brothers, and The Ramones. But Spector's personal life was not exactly praised. In her autobiography, his second ex-wife Ronnie Bennett accused him of holding her prisoner at his mansion during the 70s. Some of his children also claimed he was extremely abusive behind closed doors. In 2003, Spector invited actress Lana Clarkson to his California mansion after a night out partying and drinking. What started out as a day full of fun went terribly wrong at some point, and Clarkson ended up dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Defense attorneys argued that the struggling performer took her own life, but a jury convicted Spector of second-degree murder in 2009. He was sentenced to serve 19 years in prison. By then, he was well into his 70s and his health was visibly deteriorating. It was suspected that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, and in 2014, Spector lost his ability to speak thanks to a medical condition. He recently died at a hospital in early 2021 from COVID-related complications. 7. Shan Kingston. American-Jamaican singer Shan Kingston broke onto the music scene in 2007 with his hit song Beautiful Girls after being found on MySpace. He had major success with a handful of other songs, but by 2013 he'd largely fallen out of the limelight. Since then, Kingston has made headlines for not paying for high-end and custom jewelry, leading to speculation that he'd spent all of his fortune he made from music and was trying to uphold a false image of wealth and status. In 2015, he accused representatives from Avian Jewelers of kidnapping him during a business meeting. According to a police report, Kingston chose not to pay the $40,000 balance he owed the company on a $225,000 watch because he didn't feel like the piece was worth that much. The company offered to let him swap it for a less expensive item, but allegedly took the watch back from Kingston and ultimately refused to give him anything in exchange. Kingston claimed that the executives he met with refused to let him out of the vehicle and dropped him off in a secluded area. The bizarre incident came a year after Avidan Jeweler sued him for also allegedly failing to pay off a $356,000 debt. An additional lawsuit filed in 2016 accused the singer of making a $1,000 down payment on $300,000 worth of necklaces, watches, chains, and rings at a New York City jewelry store, and failing to have his manager wire the amount as promised. The company reportedly received just 2 checks that bounced and had no luck in their efforts to get him to pay up. In 2020, a Florida-based jeweler claimed Kingston had an outstanding balance for some custom pieces, resulting in an arrest warrant. Kingston is now worth only an estimated $500,000 according to Celebrity Net Worth, which amounts to less than the amount of jewelry he's been accused of not paying for. 6. Tila Tequila. By the time she shot to fame as the queen of MySpace back in 2006, Tila Tequila modeled for multiple well-known brands like Playboy, Stuff, and Maxim. In 2007, she hosted an MTV dating show called A Shot at Love with Tila Tequila and released a single while trying to pursue a singing career. Above all, she was perhaps best known for her provocative fashion sense and behavior. Tila's music failed to take off and her popularity eventually decreased. She dabbled briefly in the adult entertainment industry, and in 2015 she landed a spot on a reality series called Big Brother. But she was booted off the show after a single day when viewers raised the alarm about some concerning anti-Semitic comments she made on social media in her past. She also posted a disturbing article she wrote about openly admitting to being a Nazi sympathizer. Facebook actually banned Tila Tequila. She initially apologized, blaming her behavior on depression and drug addictions. But she kept posting derogatory and bigoted material, and by the end of 2016 she was a despised nobody in the celebrity world. She was eventually kicked off Twitter too, and began spewing out her bizarre and disturbing views on YouTube, but not many people listened or cared. In addition to supporting the alt-right, the former model is also a flat earther, but that's not surprising. The few who have bothered to pay attention to the washed-up celebrity have noticed in recent years that her rants have become increasingly bizarre, often consisting of claims that she's the Messiah and possessed by Satan. Her drab, makeupless appearance has also generated shock, with many saying she looks like a completely different person than her heyday. 5. Mike Richards. After the passing of longtime Jeopardy host Alex Trebek, the show's producers set out to find someone new to take over the reins. As part of their efforts, the show featured a guest rotation that included popular celebrity hosts, including former Reading Rainbow host LeVar Burton, a journalist and NBC News anchor Savannah Guthrie, former NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers, and more. But the job finally went to Mike Richards, a producer and game show host who'd worked on some incredibly successful shows like Wheel of Fortune, The Price is Right, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Let's Make a Deal, and Jeopardy itself. The decision was immediately met with controversy from those who believed Richard had been guaranteed the job and that the show merely staged a competition for who would receive the position. People were also upset to learn about Richard's past lawsuits, including 2 wrongful termination cases that accused him of firing models without valid cause and of making gross remarks about women. Controversial details of his past continued bubbling up to the surface, including his alleged stereotyping of women, Jews, and disabled individuals on his podcast, The Random Show. Richards later took the podcast online and apologized for his words, but by then the damage was already done. Just 9 days after being named the new host of Jeopardy, he stepped down from the position. He initially retained the job as the executive producer of Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune with the support of Sony Pictures. But the company must have rethought its decision since he was fired shortly after resigning as a host. 4. The Dixie Chicks. The country band, once called the Dixie Chicks, now just referred to as the Chicks, achieved impressive fame during the late 90s and early 2000s with multi-platinum records, hit singles, and multiple Grammy Awards. But the trio was hit with major controversy in 2003 when the lead singer Natalie Maines criticized then-President George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq. This wouldn't necessarily be a career-ruining move for most music genres, and even Bush himself didn't seem that put off by the remarks. When asked for comment, he emphasized that the Dixie Chicks are free to speak their mind. But the remarks ruffled feathers for many country music fans, who often harbor deep-rooted patriotism and more conservative political leanings. Radio stations across the US were flooded with thousands of angry calls demanding that they stop playing the Dixie Chicks music, and there were even petitions to boycott the group's upcoming album release and tour altogether. Maines later apologized, and the band has continued to perform over the years, but they never fully recovered from the emotional and financial impacts of this backlash. In 2020, they released their first album in over 15 years. 3. Wesley Snipes. Wesley Snipes was at the height of his acting career when he was accused of not filing his taxes and sending in false tax returns during the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2006, he responded to a federal indictment by claiming he was a non-resident alien of the US, when records claim that he's actually a citizen by birth. This is reportedly a common strategy among self-described sovereign citizens who believe they're only bound by their interpretation of the country's laws. Snipes eventually had no choice but to face the music in court. In 2008, a jury dismissed 2 felony charges over conspiracy to defraud the government and filing a false claim, but convicted him of 3 other misdemeanor counts of deliberately failing to file federal tax returns. He was sentenced to serve out 3 years in prison despite his lawyer's plea for leniency, and was ordered to pay about $17 million back in back taxes and penalties. Snipes apologized in court and immediately made a $5 million down payment to the IRS before heading off to prison. He was released in 2013 and continued his acting career. In the years since, he's slowly been making a steady comeback. 2. Steve Yu. After his 1997 debut, Yu Sung-jun, better known as Steve Yu, became one of the most popular K-pop singers in South Korea. His career was still on the rise when he announced in 2002 that he would begin his mandatory military service in accordance with the country's current laws. But he became a naturalized US citizen right before he was supposed to be drafted, and because South Korea doesn't recognize dual citizenship, the government accused him of deserting the military, deported him, and permanently banned him from coming back to the country. Yu continued to focus on music and expanded his talents into acting, but he never achieved the explosive level of fame he experienced before the military scandal. For many years, he didn't seem to mind his home country's banishment. In 2011, he said he had no plans to return, but Yu's tone eventually changed. He petitioned to have his ban lifted, but the government firmly denied his pleas, and he's exhausted all resources. In recent years, he's lived a mostly quiet life as a married family man with 4 children, with the extent of his fame limited to periodic updates on the draft dodging scandal and a few YouTube videos showing off his workouts. 1. Aaron Carter. Child star Aaron Carter grew up in the shadow of his older brother and Backstreet Boys singer Nick Carter. He pursued his own music career at the tender age of 9 with the debut of his first album dating back to 1997. But the young star's adulthood was full of mental health struggles, family issues, and many other obstacles. And while he remained well known in the celebrity circle, he fell short of sweeping fame. Carter continued to make appearances, one including Dancing with the Stars, and he intermittently released music over the years. But as time passed, he became better known for his battle with addiction than anything else. The troubled star found himself in and out of rehab centers and in constant trouble with the law. This new lifestyle had noticeable effects on his appearance and health. In recent years, he became gaunt and malnourished looking, at one point dropping to only 115 pounds despite being 6 feet tall. Carter also faced some financial issues. He had a 7-figure tax debt that led to him declaring bankruptcy in 2013. In 2020, he jumped on the OnlyFans bandwagon and started selling adult content at a steep asking price of $50 to $125 per photo, but it failed to achieve the popularity he was hoping for. He released his most recent album, Blacklisted, in the latter half of 2022. Just 2 days later, he was found dead in the bathtub at his Lancaster, California home at just 34 years old. His cause of death hasn't been revealed, but it's widely believed that Carter died from a drug overdose. His fiancée and the mother of his children, Melanie Martin, told the US Sun that he relapsed before his death. In a desperate attempt to stop him from abusing drugs, she called local office supply stores and begged them not to sell Carter cleaning products and aerosol cans. But, like his other loved ones, she was ultimately unable to stop him from breaking down and succumbing to his demons.
Number 10. Gonzalo Lopez. As a high-risk inmate serving a life sentence at a Texas prison, convicted murderer Gonzalo Lopez was put in both hand and leg restraints whenever he was transported outside of the prison. He was also locked in a special cage within the vehicle. Yet he still somehow managed to escape during a ride to a medical appointment in 2022 by breaking out of his restraints and cutting his way out of the cage while fellow inmates distracted the driver and another officer. Lopez attacked the driver, and a lengthy struggle ensued between the two as they fell out of the bus and continued to fight on the ground. At some point, he managed to get back on the bus and drive away, while the driver and officer shot at him and the vehicle's tires. After getting just a mile down the road, Lopez wrecked the bus. He slipped out of sight and vanished into the wilderness on foot. The highly dangerous fugitive was still on the run 3 weeks later when he murdered a 67-year-old grandfather and 4 of the man's grandchildren. He stole some guns from the home and fled the scene in the victim's truck. Police set spike strips in an attempt to capture Lopez, who kept driving even after running over the spikes. He drove through a field and began shooting at officers from behind the wheel when he lost control of the truck and crashed into a utility pole. Lopez continued to shoot at the police, leaving them with no choice but to return fire. He died in the shootout. His escape left many wondering how an inmate managed to bypass such heavy security measures and make his way past 2 armed guards. Consequently, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice implemented some changes to prevent a similar catastrophe from ever happening. Number 9. Jessica Boomershine. In early 2020, Jessica Boomershine and Billy Joe Farah abducted an 85-year-old man they met at a casino in Montgomery County, Ohio. They broke into the victim's home and forced the senior citizen to give up his ATM card and PIN at gunpoint. The couple then forced the man into the trunk of his car, withdrew money from an ATM, and abandoned the vehicle. The victim pulled the emergency release lever inside the trunk and sought help from workers at a nearby waste management facility. Police soon found Boomershine and Farah and took them into custody. While awaiting the next step of the booking process, Boomershine attempted to escape through the ceiling, but the tiles failed to hold under her weight and she came crashing through to the floor. She was unharmed, but did major damage to the ceiling. She took a plea deal for her crimes and is currently serving a 25 to 30-year sentence, which is significantly less than the amount of time she could have faced if she went to trial. Number 8. Blaine and Susan Barksdale. 72-year-old Frank Bly disappeared in 2019 following a fire at his Tucson home. His body was nowhere to be found, but authorities ruled his death a homicide. By the time they identified Blaine and Susan Barksdale as their prime suspects, the couple had fled the area. The U.S. Marshals Service tracked them down more than 2,000 miles, 3,219 kilometers away, in Rochester, New York, and hired a private security contractor to return them to Arizona. While being transported through Utah in a prison van, Susan Barksdale claimed that she urgently needed to use the bathroom, and the driver pulled over. The Barksdales then attacked the 2 unarmed guards supervising the vehicle. They tied the guards up and put them in the back of the van with a 3rd prisoner who wasn't involved in the escape. The couple drove the van to an acquaintance's house in Arizona, where Blaine took a friend's pickup truck. Susan continued to drive the van until they reached the middle of the desert, where she abandoned it with all 3 captives inside. Luckily, the keys were still in the van when the trio broke free hours later and made their way to a sheriff's office. But the amount of time it took for them to notify anyone of the escape gave the Barksdales an 8-hour head start. They were nowhere to be found, despite a statewide search generating hundreds of tips. But the couple's life on the run only lasted a few weeks before authorities found them in an isolated remote enclave and finally got them behind bars. Blaine received a 22-year prison sentence for murder, and Susan was sentenced to 5 years for manslaughter. Number 7. Shawn Bush and Roger Rios. One day in October 2022, staff at the Pima County Jail in Arizona discovered 31-year-old Shawn Bush and 26-year-old Roger Rios suffering from what appeared to be a drug overdose. The 2 inmates were transported to a local hospital. While there, Rios reportedly leapt out of his bed and tried to flee his room. Staff noticed right away, given the increased level of law enforcement that one can expect at a hospital where 2 prisoners are being treated. Rios was apprehended so quickly that Bush didn't even have an opportunity to try escaping. Both men were taken back to jail. Local authorities said that heightened security measures were being implemented following the incident to prevent any similar close calls from happening. Number 6. David Watson. David Watson was being unloaded from a prisoner van at a high-security psychiatric hospital in Maryland in 2017 when he shoved a guard to the ground and ran off into the wilderness. The 28-year-old, who was serving a 100-year sentence for the attempted murder of a police officer, had somehow freed himself from handcuffs and a waist chain. He managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement despite fleeing with nothing more than the clothes on his back. Numerous reported sightings were called in, including one that described a man in a construction hat and vest who was seen running. Watson stole the items from a nearby storage building. Then the discarded hat and vest were found later that day. After concluding that Watson was no longer in the immediate area, the U.S. Marshals Service took over the case and offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who might have information leading to the convict's whereabouts. Using night vision technology, a team found him hiding in an 18-inch, 45.7-centimeter drain pipe in a wooded area. Watson surrendered without incident and was locked back up. Number 5. Juan Fidencio Romo de la Rosa. 39-year-old Juan Fidencio Romo de la Rosa was serving an 8-year federal prison sentence in the U.S. for illegally trafficking human migrants when he attempted to break out in 2020. Guards at the medium security facility in Beaumont, Texas, first noticed that something was wrong when a fence alarm went off. Officers rushed outside to find De La Rosa trying to climb the fence. He was injured and bloody from coming into contact with barbed wire, but was nevertheless determined to flee. By then, he had already gotten past an interior fence and was in the process of trying to scale an outer fence. De La Rosa surrendered to the guards at gunpoint and was charged for the attempted escape. He received an additional sentence of 27 months, lengthening his stay by more than 2 years. Number 4. Michael Brady. In what would tragically become known as North Carolina's deadliest attempted prison breakout, 4 inmates fatally stabbed and bludgeoned 2 guards, a maintenance worker and a sewing plant manager in 2017. Disturbing footage of the incident shows the convicts standing over the motionless victims with hammers and scissors in their hands. The prisoners tried to leave, but dozens of guards sprang into action. They surrendered just outside the facility. At the crime scene, investigators found pre-packed survival bags that the inmates planned on using in the event that their escape was successful. At the time, the state was experiencing a severe prison staffing shortage, forcing employees to take shortcuts that put their own safety at risk. Workers were also suffering from burnout and complacency, according to a National Institute of Corrections report. Consequently, staff members failed to keep accurate track of the prisoners' inventory of tools and dangerous chemicals. Doors were left unlocked, and inmates had an opportunity to take things without anyone noticing. Michael Brady, who had a lengthy criminal record dating back to his teens and was serving a 25-year sentence for attempted murder, was the first of the 4 suspects to go on trial. Jurors saw footage of him telling investigators that he was motivated to commit the attempted breakout because he was upset about his sentence and felt like he had nothing to lose. The defense brought up Brady's difficult childhood, which was reportedly fraught with abuse and mental health issues, but the jury apparently didn't see this as a viable explanation for his actions or for going easy on him in any way. After deliberating for just a half hour, they voted to convict him on a laundry list of charges, including murder and attempted escape. Brady was sentenced to death for his crimes. The remaining 3 suspects have yet to go on trial. They're accused of planning the escape for months ahead of time and are also facing murder charges. Number 3. Wasson Asai. While being treated at a Fairfax, Virginia hospital in 2015, suspected serial bank robber Wasson Asai watched and waited until a guard took a bathroom break. The 42-year-old somehow slipped out of his shackles, stole a gun from a second guard, and fled on foot in his hospital gown. Asai was in federal custody on suspicion of robbing 12 banks and using a bicycle as a getaway vehicle each time, showing that he was already a seasoned pro when it came to evading law enforcement. Following his escape, authorities embarked on a 9-hour manhunt, deploying hundreds of officers and dogs, along with a helicopter. After allegedly stealing 2 cars, Asai was spotted on a Washington, D.C. bus, where a civilian recognized him and tipped off the police. The police said it was incredibly fortunate that nobody got hurt during the escapee's short-lived time on the run. Asai was sentenced to 32 years in prison for his crimes, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. Number 2. Darko Dek. Sometimes a seemingly flawless jailbreak backfires years or even decades later. Over 30 years ago, 35-year-old Darko Dek was sentenced to 33 months in an Australian prison for growing marijuana. He escaped in 1992 by using a hacksaw blade to cut through the window of his cell and a crowbar to get past the prison's fence. One of the main motivations for Dek's escape was the fear that he would be deported to Yugoslavia once he finished serving his time. At the time, there was a brutal war going on as Yugoslavia's republics fought for their independence from communist dictatorship. Dek was afraid of being forced to fight or detained in conditions far worse than he stood to experience at an Australian prison. He managed to avoid detection over the years while working as a handyman in Sydney's beach communities. But when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and forced everyone into lockdown, he found himself without an income. He turned himself into law enforcement and admitted to his escape from decades earlier. He was sent to prison to serve the 14 remaining months on his sentence, plus 2 months for the escape. By then, Yugoslavia was no longer a country, begging the question of what would happen to Dek, who still faced deportation. If a country that now exists in place of Yugoslavia agreed to accept him, that's likely where he would go. He's afraid to return to a place he doesn't know, and of the consequences he could suffer there for any of his perceived wrongdoings. The local community is standing behind Dek as his lawyer fights to get his case commuted, which would enable him to stay in Australia. But for now, his future remains uncertain. Number 1. Frank Freshwaters. After receiving a suspended 20-year prison sentence for a deadly hit-and-run in 1957, 22-year-old Frank Freshwaters violated his probation and was thrown back behind bars to serve out the rest of his sentence at an Ohio penitentiary. He escaped a couple of years later and obtained a new identity under the name William Harold Cox, the same name he was using when police in West Virginia responded to a call about a domestic incident in 1975. They found a fugitive hiding under his kitchen sink. In an unlikely stroke of luck, the state governor refused to extradite Freshwaters to Ohio. He was released from custody and disappeared again. The case was more or less forgotten about until 2015, when the 56-year-old case was reopened. U.S. Marshals traced the convict's alias to a trailer park outside Melbourne, Florida, where undercover agents tricked him into signing some paperwork. They tested his prints, and sure enough, it was a match to Freshwaters' case from decades earlier. The 79-year-old was transported to Ohio and put back in prison, probably the last place any senior citizen wants to be. He faced a potential of remaining locked up until age 97, meaning he could very well spend the rest of his life in prison. Freshwaters' lawyers argued to the parole board that he had lived mostly on the straight and narrow during his more than half-century on the run, and he was paroled in 2016.
Clarence and Carmen Jenkins. In 2008, a woman named Sue Bostic found a garbage bag with dismembered body parts inside it and a note full of threats on her car outside her home in Greenville, South Carolina. The note was addressed to Miss Bostic's niece, Grace Davis. But police were at a loss when it came to figuring out whose body parts were in the bag, why, and who could have put them there. Later that same day, another one of Grace Davis's relatives found a different bag filled with severed pieces of a body and a threatening note outside their home. Detectives determined the note was timed at a local library and found surveillance footage of the couple they suspected were behind everything. They also tracked down Grace Davis and showed her the video of the two individuals. She identified them as Clarence and Carmen Jenkins and said she'd been involved in a romantic throuple relationship with the pair for quite some time. Grace told investigators she left the unconventional arrangement because Clarence started to become extremely controlling. She wanted to get her troubled life back on track, and she knew she couldn't do it under his possessive thumb and watchful eye. Clarence was allegedly outraged by Grace's decision to walk away from him, and he refused to take no for an answer. But Grace claimed she didn't know anything about the dismembered body parts or why they were showing up on her relatives' doorsteps too. Using a fingerprint tracing database, police identified the body parts as 34-year-old Nicole Harris, a troubled single mother who struggled with drug addiction, but was trying to get on the right path for her children. They obtained a search warrant for the Jenkins trailer, where they found copies of the threatening note, blood spatter, a suspected murder weapon, and other evidence connecting the couple with Mechol's death. Clarence and Carmen were later charged with murder. It wasn't until over a year later when Carmen finally decided to speak up and tell detectives her full version of events. She claimed Clarence was so angry about Grace leaving their relationship that he thought he could somehow win her back by intimidating her with these body parts. Carmen said her husband tried forcing her to kill Grace, but she wasn't strong enough to strangle the victim to death, so he ended up doing it himself. Then they brutally cut up her body. The case was recently featured in the Discovery Plus series American Detective. During the show, detectives said that Carmen's confession was awkward and stone cold, and that she showed no apparent emotion or remorse while recalling the events. She did apologize in court though, and managed to get her sentence reduced from 50 to 40 years. Meanwhile, Clarence is serving a life sentence without possibility of parole. 7. Joe Constance. On the morning of June 5, 2011, a man named Joe Constant shot his way into his estranged wife's home in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. He cornered several people inside, threatening to shoot and physically assault them unless they told him where his wife was. Constance eventually found his wife, 49-year-old Mary Duhon. He then shot her and fled the scene in his pickup truck after he was certain she was dead. A manhunt started almost immediately, but Constance was nowhere to be found. Some neighbors overheard the gunfire and saw people running, but they couldn't offer much in terms of valuable leads. Joe has managed to evade authorities for over 11 years now, making him one of the FBI's most wanted violent criminals. Constance was even featured on America's Most Wanted, in hopes that one of the show's million viewers might recognize him and help law enforcement find his whereabouts. But the plea for information led nowhere, and Constance hasn't slipped up yet. In a 2014 interview, the Calcasieu Sheriff Lieutenant Les Blanchard said his agency pulled out all the stops and used all resources available in their attempts to locate Constance. They searched by air and boat and even expanded their efforts to the bordering countries, Canada and Mexico, but came no closer to finding the fugitive. Constance's ability to remain hidden is extremely concerning given the violent nature of his crimes, and authorities still consider him armed and dangerous. They're hoping someone will spot him and come forward, so they can hopefully take Joe off the streets for good. 6. The Chillicothe Killer. The small Ohio town of Chillicothe was left shaken when women started to mysteriously disappear in May 2014. Between then and late 2015, 6 women vanished, but only 4 bodies have been found. To further complicate things, many have accused law enforcement of grossly mishandling these cases. Mother of 2 Charlotte Trago was the first to go. She was never seen or heard from again after her mother dropped her off at her apartment home one day. The disappearances continued on from there. When 30-year-old Tamika Lynch's husband called the police to report her missing, they told him there was no reason to suspect any foul play. After that, authorities ruled the suspicious death of 20-year-old Shasta Himmelreck a suicide. In the meantime, 26-year-old Tiffany Sire, 38-year-old Timberly Claytor, and 31-year-old Rebecca Cade all turned up dead, but authorities took little action. In 2019, Chillicothe Police Chief Keith Washburn and Ross County Sheriff George Lavender told the Chillicothe Gazette they were doing everything in their power to solve the cases they considered unsolved. They were not convinced the deaths were linked, even though the victims' families insisted otherwise. A task force dedicated specifically to solving these mysteries has still not formally named any suspects or made any arrests, which means that at least one very dangerous individual remains free to roam the streets. Washburn claimed it would be difficult to interview potential witnesses and people with information because several of the victims who ran in circles with people had so-called mental health and drug problems, in his own words. When past attempts were made to interview people, they showed up higher than a kite, which wasn't helpful for the case. 3 of the cases are now considered closed, but remain shrouded in questions and controversy. Many people are unconvinced the disappearances and deaths aren't the handiwork of just one person. 2 women remain missing, and 1 death is officially classed as an unsolved homicide. These women's stories were featured in the 2016 docu-series The Vanishing Women, which examined the circumstances surrounding each of the cases and law enforcement's alleged shortcomings in their responses. 5. William Devon Howell. In 2003, detectives were left baffled when 7 women went missing in Connecticut. They finally got a lead the following year when a convicted sex offender named William Devon Howell became a suspect in the disappearance case of a prostitute named Nilsa Arizmendi. She was last seen getting into Howell's van after she and her boyfriend humbly agreed to let him spend the night with them in their hotel room. Arizmendi's blood was found inside William's van, leading to Howell's manslaughter conviction. Other evidence, including footage of Howell engaging in bizarre acts with other women, indicating that Arizmendi might not have been his only victim. Howell insisted he was innocent. He even claimed he didn't kill Arizmendi and that her blood got on his van during a fight she had with her boyfriend. Because no other bodies had been found, authorities lacked the evidence they needed to charge Howell with other crimes. Weeks after he accepted a plea deal in exchange for a 15-year sentence in connection to Arizmendi's death, a hunter found the remains of several missing women in a wooded spot behind a strip mall. Detectives unearthed 7 bodies total. With the help of jailhouse snitches, prosecutors managed to secure several convictions against Howell, who's now serving 6 consecutive life sentences. Hopefully, he'll never be able to lay hands on a woman again. 4. Maryvale serial shooter. In 2015 and 2016, a gunman shot 12 people in Phoenix, killing 9 and injuring 3. He chose his targets at random, but seemed to favor one of the city's predominantly Latino neighborhoods, Maryvale. Police had little to go on at first. The little information they could give the public was just a vague description of the shooter as being either a white or light-complexion Latino man in his 20s. The case was about to go cold when suddenly a person of interest was arrested for unrelated charges in 2017. Interestingly enough, a witness came into the police station and identified 23-year-old Aaron Sucado as the shooter out of a lineup containing a person of interest to the unrelated crime. Investigators were then able to connect Saucedo's car and gun to the mass shootings. They charged him with a slew of crimes, including 9 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty though, and the case hit unexpected delays thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. Saucedo's trial is set to begin again later this year. 3. The Cleveland Strangler. Anthony Sowell's life of crime started way back in 1989 when he kidnapped and assaulted a pregnant woman in Cleveland, Ohio. He served 15 years in prison for this and was released in 2005. Less than 2 years after Sowell regained his freedom, his neighbors noticed a foul odor coming from out of his house. They complained to the health department, but nothing was done, but the stench then continued to linger. Police finally got a warrant to search Sowell's property in 2009 and found the remains of 11 women. 2 victims were buried in shallow graves in the basement, and 4 were found on the home's 3rd floor. 4 others were buried in Sowell's backyard, and a human skull was found inside a bucket. Most victims were strangled, either manually or with a ligature. During the investigation, it was also discovered that Sowell had brutally assaulted 3 survivors who'd come over to his place to smoke crack cocaine with him. He was convicted of all 11 murders and sentenced to death, but died in prison last year in 2021 from a terminal illness. Sowell's disgusting crimes were featured in the documentary Unseen, which addresses the systemic marginalization that his victims and their families faced in their attempts to try and get help from law enforcement. The survivors and the loved ones of Sowell's victims sued detectives for mishandling their complaints and received a $1.3 million payout. But this does little to compensate for what many believe were needless and preventable deaths, let alone the immense suffering the families endured. 2. Michael Madison. In 2013, police in East Cleveland responded to calls about a foul odor in a Glenville neighborhood. It wasn't long before they found the bodies of 3 women, Sherelda Terry, Angela Deskins, and Shatisha Shealy. The women had been assaulted, tortured, mutilated, and strangled to death. Then their bodies were wrapped in garbage bags. Detectives connected the brutal murders to a convicted sex offender named Michael Madison. They obtained a search warrant for his home and charged Madison with aggravated murder and several other crimes after finding more evidence of human decomposition in his home. He coldly confessed to the crimes without showing any remorse. During his trial, he taunted and smiled at the victims' families, cementing his verdict. One of the victims' fathers, Van Terry, attacked Madison from the witness stand. Footage of the encounter went viral, with many commentators stating that they felt the assault was well-deserved. Madison's neighbor told the media that about a month before the killing, Madison threatened to kill women in the same way the notorious Cleveland Strangler Anthony Sowell had a few years earlier. A jury convicted Madison of 13 charges, including murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, rape, and being an ex-convict in possession of a weapon. He received the death penalty and appealed it, but a court upheld the sentence in the end. Madison is currently still alive, but awaiting his fate on death row. 1. The Grim Sleeper. A terrifying serial killer nicknamed the Grim Sleeper committed his first murder during the mid-80s in Los Angeles. He targeted vulnerable sex workers who struggle with drug addictions. After killing women, he dumped their naked bodies in alleyways and on roadsides. When the Grim Sleeper began his campaign of terror, multiple serial killers were also working in the area. In other words, detectives had their work cut out for them, and resources were spread very thin. It's unclear how many women the Grim Sleeper murdered before he took a hiatus from killing in 1988. His crimes continued to go unsolved after he continued his murder spree during the early 2000s. The killer claimed his final victim, though, 25-year-old Janisha Peters, in 2007. But it wasn't until 3 years later that the Grim Sleeper was finally identified as a man named Lonnie David Franklin Jr., thanks to breakthrough DNA technology. Using a method called familial or genealogical DNA, police searched their database for DNA profiles that had similarities to the Grim Sleeper's. They landed on Franklin's son, who was too young to commit most of the murders. But investigators took a closer look at Franklin himself and determined he was actually the killer. They searched his home and found hours of footage and more than 1,000 photos of multiple women. There are many lingering questions regarding their identities and connections they might have to the Grim Sleeper's crimes. But all signs point toward the likelihood that Franklin killed more people than the authorities ever knew about. He was convicted of 10 murders and 1 attempted murder, and thankfully it was enough to not only put him away for life, but to sentence him to death too. Franklin never lived to see his execution date though. He was found dead in his cell in 2020. His body showed no signs of trauma, according to officials, who said the Grim Sleeper's cause of death would be announced pending the results of an autopsy. But the results have yet to be released to the public, leaving the circumstances of this murderer's death a mystery. Thanks for watching. What would you do if you were being targeted by a killer? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.